what they're saying about this law. And there we have Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie surrounded by other officials, and we'll be hearing what they'll be saying about this very shortly. Hong Kong has seen months of protests, and many of these protesters have been wearing masks. And this has been an issue for debate amongst the public. So just to remind you, the Chief Executive and the city's cabinet have approved the use of an emergency law to enact anti-mask legislation. This legislation will take effect from midnight. Lawmakers had set up a committee to call for the law on Thursday, and they said it's very challenging for police officers to collect evidence if protesters wear masks. And they're also saying the legislation will not affect people's rights to wear masks in legal gatherings. And that's Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie amongst other officials, the Special Administrative Region's government. And shortly they'll be giving a press conference to speak on this law that's just been enacted and to take effect from midnight.
各位傳媒朋友，多謝大家今日嚟呢個記者會。稍後咧，行政長官同埋官員咧會先向大家發言，之後會接受大家嘅提問。而家我哋先請行政長官。
各位傳媒朋友，各位香港市民，過去接近4個月，因修訂逃犯條例引起嘅示威同埋衝突，
protests and confrontations arising from
唔同嘅地區發生咗超過400場
from the opposition to the extradition bill has been ongoing. There have been many protests, demonstrations and assemblies. Very often they descended into violence. So far 1,100 people have been injured and 300 of them were police officers enforcing the law. The violent incidents have become more and more frequent, affecting more and more places, and also these violence is getting worse. And rioters or radical protesters have been targeting different parts of Hong Kong, trying to spread terror. They've wreaked havoc to Hong Kong. The day-to-day life of people of Hong Kong have been affected. Employees, large, small and medium-sized enterprises are all very concerned about the future of Hong Kong. People are asking, can Hong Kong go back to normal? Is Hong Kong still a place where we can have our sweet home? People across sectors have been making appeals that we should all put aside our differences, that we must stop the violence so that we could go back to peace. We must stop violence, and we support the police in enforcing the law. We must make sure that all government departments are trying to respond to these incidents and lessen the impact on the public as far as possible. That's always been the position of the government. That's always been our objective. The ruling team of the government has been trying various actions to try to walk out of this plight together with the people. A month ago, I announced 4 actions or initiatives. That is to provide a good basis for dialogue. So I formally withdrew the relevant extradition bill, and then we started a dialogue platform involving various parties. Last week, there was an open community dialogue. it was to find a way out for Hong Kong. And then I'm also preparing my policy address. Policy initiatives will be proposed to deal with deep-rooted problems in Hong Kong. And then I will also propose to invite scholars and experts to conduct independent review on these deep-rooted issues. But unfortunately, what the public see is that in recent days, especially on the 29th of September and the 1st of October, what we see is escalation in violence. We've seen changes to these shockingly violent incidents. Now, firstly, in the past, these protests were confined to 1 or 2 areas, but now it's all over Hong Kong, across the territory. Secondly, previously, there were cases of arson, hurling of petrol bombs, but they was on the street or outside the MTR stations. But now they're doing it inside the MTR station, and that could lead to serious danger. Thirdly, buildings were substantially vandalized, but mostly these were public buildings in the past. But now, some protesters targeted certain buildings or shops. Fourthly, for people holding different views in the past, there was just some bickering or some assault, but now there's lynching to resolve these matters. And then finally, in the past, there was just confrontation or ambush on police officers, but now there's mob assault, there's the use of lethal weapons, corrosive liquids, snatching of suspects and snatching of police pistols. So the police have no choice but to use their guns to try to save their own lives. And then there's another very worrying trend. Now, in the past, in the recent protests and violent protests, we see a large number of students taking part. From June to August, the number of students arrested accounted for about 25% of those arrested. But from September, since the start of school to now, the percentage has gone up to 38%. And in fact, in a case where a protester was shot and injured, he's also a secondary school student. So we see escalating violence. Public order is a very dangerous state. And then the large number of students taking part in protests is a warning sign. Now, the violence is destroying Hong Kong. And then young people who are our future are now placed in a very dangerous position. So we must do our utmost to end violence and prevent students from breaking the law. Further, we must save Hong Kong, the present Hong Kong and the future Hong Kong. Now, because there have been cases of public order being compromised in recent days, so as a responsible government, we must not shy away from existing legislation without using such legislation. We can't just leave a situation to get worse and worse. As I and the Secretary for Justice said before, we have been examining existing laws to see which provisions could be used effectively to deal with the current situation. That includes increasing the deterrent effect for those who try to break the law, and also measures to help the police to enforce the law. This morning, I called a special meeting of the Executive Council. The Chief Executive and Council decided to invoke the Emergency Regulations Ordinance to enact a prohibition on face covering regulation. Now, this has been discussed for a long time in the committee as the anti-mask legislation. This regulation will come into effect tomorrow, the 5th of October. Why do we need to have this piece of regulation? It's because in the past 4 months, we've seen that almost all protesters who carried out vandalism vandalism and violence covered their face. The purpose was to hide their identity and evade the law, and they have become more and more daring. So we believe the prohibition on face covering regulation will be an effective deterrent to radical behavior, and it will also help the police in enforcing the law. In a moment, the Secretary for Justice will be briefing you on the content of the regulation. We note that many have openly expressed support for an anti-mask legislation. They have pointed out that in other countries there is a similar law. But I note also there are people against the enactment of an anti-mask legislation, and they've questioned certain legal principles and they have expressed concerns. In a moment, I will invite the Secretary for Justice to give a response. Now, what I would like to say to the people of Hong Kong is this. It is not an easy decision to legislate to ban masks, but given the current situation in Hong Kong, this is a necessary decision. I would like to stress 4 points. Firstly, now, what we're invoking is the Emergency Regulations Ordinance. And under that, we are enacting the prohibition in face covering regulation. But that does not mean Hong Kong is in a state of emergency. The Chief Executive Council has not declared Hong Kong having entered a state of emergency. It's just that the ordinance gives powers to the Chief Executive Council that when we believe there is a danger to public order, then we could act accordingly. Now, I don't think anyone will question that in Hong Kong we have already seen the scenario of public order being endangered. So therefore, we could invoke the Emergency Regulation Ordinance, and then the Chief Executive Council could make any regulations that are in line with public interest. So I must stress that, yes, we are using the Emergency Regulations Ordinance, and then the regulation we are enacting is a prohibition on face covering. But it doesn't mean Hong Kong is in a state of emergency. But at the same time, the situation we've seen in Hong Kong is does satisfy this requirement of endangering public order. And secondly, this regulation aims to end violence and return us to peace. I believe that is the aspiration of all in Hong Kong. And thirdly, the regulation will target those who use violence. We understand there may be other people who need to wear a mask or cover their face because of a legitimate need. That's why in the regulation there are exemption clauses where there is a reasonable defense, the needs of these people would be taken care of. So we believe, therefore, the regulation has struck the right balance. In a moment, the Secretary for Justice or the Secretary for Security will be giving a detailed explanation. Finally, I would like to say this is a regulation. So the nature is that it is a subsidiary legislation. It is a piece of subsidiary legislation by negative vetting. That means when the Legislative Council resumes on the 16th of October, the SAR government will table this piece of legislation to the Legislative Council for consideration. Now, finally, I hope the public will support and understand what we're doing, and I appeal to the public that we should all say no to violence. We must work together to let Hong Kong go back to the normal Hong Kong, a place where we can call home. I and my ruling team will continue to go by the 4 initiatives I announced earlier. Through dialogue and through more studies, hopefully we could identify the deep-rooted problems in Hong Kong and that we could respond accordingly.
In English, protests arising from the Fugitive Offenders Bill have continued for nearly 4 months now. Over this period, protesters' violence has been escalating and has reached a very alarming level in the past few days, causing numerous injuries and leading Hong Kong to a chaotic and panic situation. We are particularly concerned that many students are participating in these violent protests or even riots, jeopardizing their safety and even their future. As a responsible government, we have the duty to use all available means in order to stop the escalating violence and restore calmness in society. As the current situation has clearly given rise to a state of serious public danger, the Chief Executive in Council decided at a special meeting this morning to invoke the power under the Emergency Regulations Ordinance and make a new regulation in the name of Prohibition on Face Covering Regulation, which is essentially an anti-mask law, something which has already been introduced in a number of jurisdictions around the world and discussed here in Hong Kong. We believe that the new law will create a deterrent effect against masked violent protesters and rioters and will assist the police in its law enforcement. The Secretary for Security will later explain in greater details the provisions, and the Secretary for Justice will speak on the legal matters. I would like to emphasize that the decision to invoke the Emergency Regulations Ordinance is a difficult but also a necessary one for public interest. Let me make 4 points in conclusion. 1. Although the ordinance carries the title emergency, Hong Kong is not in a state of emergency, and we are not proclaiming that Hong Kong is entering a state of emergency. But we are indeed in an occasion of serious danger, which is a stated condition in the Emergency Regulations Ordinance for the Chief Executive in Council to exercise certain powers. And I would say that we are now in rather extensive and serious public danger. It is essential for us to stop violence and restore calmness in society as soon as possible. We hope that the new legislation can help us to achieve this objective. The second point I want to make is the objective of this regulation is to end violence and restore order. And I believe this is now the broad consensus of Hong Kong people. The third point is this regulation targets rioters or those resort to violence. That's why the regulation contains defense and exemptions to cater for legitimate needs to wear a mask, and we believe that by so doing, we have struck the necessary balance. Fourth, the regulation is a piece of subsidiary legislation subject to negative vetting. So when Legislative Council resumes on the 16th of October, the regulation will be tabled in the Legislative Council for members' discussion. Finally, let me reiterate that I and my principal officials will continue our dialogue with the public, for it is the best way to find solutions to some of the deep-seated social problems in Hong Kong and to allow Hong Kong to move forward. 我而家請保安局局長就
And that's Hong Kong's Chief Executive, Carrie Lam. Earlier, we talked to Lawrence Ma. He is the Executive Council Chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation, and he told us how this law regulating face wear is going to help police.
The major problem is the identification of the suspects who committed many offences, such as criminal damages, riots, unlawful assembly, wounding of people. So, and many of them would be able to avoid detection because of they wearing a thick mask. Sometimes with other materials on their face, so that they would be. It makes the police very difficult to identify who the offender is. So the anti-mask law would deter many of the protesters from coming out again, because of the to avoid being detected and finally arrested for their offences.
Earlier, Hong Kong's public transport authorities also held a press conference on damages caused by ongoing protests. They condemned the actions of violent protesters and discussed the repairs they had undertaken to bring the transport network back to normal.
In spite of the severe damages, the Hong Kong MTR is trying its best to reinstate service for residents. Our maintenance team is working day and night to fix broken facilities during the off times. However, they are facing many challenges. They have only 3 hours to fix and test a large amount of damaged facilities. There is simply not enough time.
Our correspondent Xu Xinchen joins us now live from Hong Kong. Xinchen, what are people there saying about this ban on face masks?
Yes, Zhao Yang. So, in fact, right now, because I'm at the press conference venue, and the ministers are actually taking questions from the reporters just this very minute. So, the main theme of this afternoon's press conference, Treasure Hong Kong and Violence. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam, along with several government officials, attended the session. Lam announced just a few minutes ago the enactment of the emergency regulations ordinance so that a mask ban can be initiated without passing through the Legislative Council, which is now in recess. Lam said that she offered 4 actions trying to ease the unrest in early September, including the withdrawal of the future bill and starting the community dialogue to find a way out for Hong Kong. However, she added that the violence continued to escalate, especially a large violent protest on September 29th, which is past Sunday, and on Tuesday, October the 1st. The chief executive also said that the violence has been spreading across the city, and the number of students involved in radical behaviors has been increasing. This is the first time use of the emergency regulations on ordinance in over half a century. The anti-mask law allows police to request people to take masks off during both authorized and unauthorized gatherings. Journalists and people wearing masks due to religious and medical reasons are exempt. However, Lam said that the government is not declaring a state of emergency yet. The use of the ordinance and setting up a mask ban during protests first surfaced in August. While some supported the legitimacy of using these laws, others argue that the emergency regulation ordinance introduced in 1922 by the British when Hong Kong is still a colony is outdated. Lawmakers we spoke with said that the government should consider all options to defuse the crisis and restore peace, including an anti-mask law. Yet, some people worry that it might agitate protesters, and some might see it as similar to the already abandoned future bill. Small-scale rallies protesting against the emergency regulations ordinance already took place here in the city around noon, even before the official announcement. Zhao Yang.
All right, thank you very much, Xu Xinchen in Hong Kong. And we'll leave it there for this edition of The World Today. I'm Zhao Yang. Thanks for watching. Sports Scene is next.